Most histories of the Second World War focus on movement, troops advancing, borders shifting, governments collapsing or rebuilding. But for millions of civilians, survival depended on something far less visible: the quiet management of daily life under systems designed to break continuity. Food supply chains failed, heating fuel disappeared, sanitation collapsed, and communication fragmented. The difference between endurance and catastrophe often came down to ordinary tools, items so mundane they rarely appear in military archives, yet so critical that entire households reorganized themselves around them. If you value serious historical analysis that looks beyond the battlefield, subscribe to the Survival Record, because the story of survival in wartime is not written only in strategy. It is written in kitchens, basements, workshops, and improvised shelters. Reliable food preservation became more important than food itself. In many occupied or bombed regions, access to food fluctuated unpredictably. The central problem was not always immediate starvation, it was instability. Families could obtain calories one week and nothing the next. Under those conditions, preservation technology determined long-term survival more than supply itself. Pressure cookers, glass jars, wax seals, and fermentation crocks became strategic household assets. Civilian manuals from Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, and occupied France all show the same pattern. Preserving seasonal surpluses was treated as a defensive measure, not domestic routine. Vegetables were pickled, meat salted, cabbage fermented, and fruits bottled in syrup when sugar could be obtained. Even small gardens could support a family for months if preservation systems worked reliably. What matters historically is how this normalized decentralized food storage. Governments later studied these civilian practices when designing Cold War emergency preparedness programs. The principle that supply interruptions are survivable only if storage methods are widely distributed emerged directly from wartime household experience. Controlled heat sources determined whether homes remained livable through infrastructure collapse. Urban bombing and fuel rationing did more than make heating scarce, they made it inconsistent. Centralized heating systems failed when electricity grids were damaged or coal deliveries stopped. In response, households turned to compact, controllable heat sources: cast iron stoves, kerosene heaters, and even modified cooking ranges that could burn scrap wood or compressed fuel bricks. These devices were rarely efficient, but efficiency was not the priority. Predictability was. A small stove that could burn almost anything, furniture fragments, peat, paper briquettes, allowed families to maintain a single heated room. This heat concentration strategy became standard across Europe, from London blackout apartments to Soviet communal housing. Post-war civil defense planning later adopted this logic. Emergency shelter design emphasized small, controllable heating units rather than reliance on grid systems. The lesson came directly from civilian adaptation. Survivable environments require independent thermal control. Water purification tools quietly prevented secondary disasters that rarely appear in war narratives. When municipal water systems were damaged, contamination followed quickly. Broken pipes allowed sewage infiltration, while overcrowding strained remaining clean sources. Boiling water was the most common response, but fuel shortages made continuous boiling impractical. As a result, improvised filtration systems became widespread. Ceramic filters, layered sand and charcoal systems, and chemical purification tablets, when available, were used extensively in both urban and rural settings. Diaries from besieged cities consistently show concern about water safety, not just availability. This had long-term military consequences. Post-war humanitarian logistics began stockpiling portable purification units specifically because wartime civilian experience demonstrated how quickly disease spreads when water systems fail. The modern emphasis on field filtration in disaster response traces directly back to these civilian survival practices. Durable clothing repair tools allowed families to survive prolonged material shortages. Textile production declined sharply in many war zones. Factories shifted to military supply, trade routes collapsed, and rationing limited civilian access to new clothing. Under these conditions, the ability to repair garments repeatedly became, well, absolutely essential. Needles, heavy thread, patch fabric, and hand-cranked sewing machines were not conveniences. They were long-term survival instruments. Winter clothing was repeatedly reinforced, resized for growing children, and repurposed from damaged garments. Blankets became coats, coats became insulation. Fabric waste was rarely discarded. This culture of continuous repair influenced later sustainability practices in both military and civilian sectors. Modern field uniform maintenance protocols, designed to extend usability under supply disruption, mirror the strategies civilian families developed under wartime constraint. Manual lighting tools preserve both safety and social structure after dark. Blackouts were imposed across large portions of Europe and Asia to reduce visibility from the air. Electrical outages made lighting unpredictable even where blackouts were not enforced. Under these conditions, controlled portable light became, honestly, indispensable. Oil lamps, candles, carbide lamps, and battery-powered torches allowed families to function after sunset without attracting attention. But their importance extended beyond visibility. Reliable lighting preserved routine, meal preparation, reading, education, basic social interaction. Maintaining daily structure reduced psychological stress and helped communities retain a sense of continuity. Later military research into morale stabilization recognized the importance of environmental predictability. Light, steady, controllable light, became understood as a psychological stabilizer as much as a practical necessity. Radios transformed from sources of information into instruments of strategic awareness. For civilians, radio ownership could mean the difference between informed decision-making and dangerous ignorance. Air raid warnings, occupation policies, evacuation instructions, and black market signals all circulated through broadcast channels, even in regions where listening to foreign broadcasts was illegal. Families maintained hidden or modified receivers. Technical improvisation was common. Homemade antennas, concealed wiring, battery adaptation. Access to information allowed households to anticipate danger rather than merely react. This fundamentally reshaped military thinking about information environments. Civilian radio use demonstrated that distributed information networks can influence behavior even under strict control. Modern doctrines of information resilience owe much to these wartime civilian communication practices. Basic medical kits replaced institutional health care when systems were overwhelmed. Hospitals were damaged, understaffed, or reserved for military casualties. Civilian medical self-reliance expanded dramatically. Household medical kits, bandages, antiseptics, basic pain relief, splints, thermometers became frontline healthcare infrastructure. Training manuals circulated widely, teaching wound care, infection prevention, and emergency treatment. Informal caregiving networks emerged within neighborhoods, distributing knowledge alongside supplies. Post-war public health planning incorporated this experience by promoting decentralized first aid training. The assumption that civilians must manage medical emergencies independently during large-scale crises originates directly from wartime household practice. Secure storage and concealment tools protected the last reserves that made recovery possible. As scarcity intensified, theft, confiscation, and forced requisition became common. Families responded by developing concealment strategies. Hidden compartments, buried containers, disguised storage within walls or floors. These methods protected food, documents, currency, and tools themselves. Survival depended not only on acquiring resources but on retaining them through unstable political conditions. Modern emergency preparedness still emphasizes secure storage, reflecting the wartime realization that resource protection is inseparable from resource acquisition. Improvised shelter materials allowed rapid adaptation when homes were damaged or abandoned. Bombing, artillery, and forced displacement made structural damage routine. Families relied on tarpaulins, salvaged timber, corrugated metal sheets, and insulation scraps to create temporary barriers against weather and exposure. These materials were rarely comfortable, but they allowed rapid re-establishment of minimal living space. The ability to rebuild partial shelter quickly reduced mortality from exposure and enabled communities to remain geographically stable rather than dispersing entirely. Contemporary disaster relief architecture, especially modular temporary housing, draws heavily from these wartime improvisations. Speed of enclosure, not structural permanence, became the defining principle. The story of these tools is not simply a story of hardship, it is a record of adaptive systems emerging under pressure. Civilian households became decentralized survival units, managing food security, water safety, medical care, communication, and environmental control with minimal institutional support. Military doctrine eventually absorbed many of these lessons. Emergency preparedness planning, civil defense infrastructure, disaster response logistics, and resilience theory all reflect knowledge first refined in ordinary homes under extraordinary conditions. Remembering these experiences matters because they reveal a dimension of war that official records rarely emphasize. Survival was not sustained only by armies or governments. It was sustained by households learning, improvising, and preserving continuity with whatever tools they could maintain. If you value this kind of careful, in-depth historical analysis, the kind that examines how people actually lived through global conflict, subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who believe history is not only about how wars are fought, but how people endure them.